Finally, you have found the hidden relic, the evil shrine, the germ of the Golgari. The soil is rich with rotten dead, and the sun's light barely shines. Everything is bathed in an eerie green glow. Yet, the hidden relic, a magic orb of necrotic energy that fuses life and death into shambling nightmares, beckons you to move forward. Come closer if you dare.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's Damien from the Barn Bards here today to show you how to make a hidden relic. What's a hidden relic, you ask? Stick around and discover the legend with today's Barn Bard special. So the hidden relic is a terrain piece that incorporates a central target, a glowing green orb I call the germ of the Golgari, which is surrounded by an aquarium piece I found online. It was inspired by a browser game I played called Forge of Empires, and in this game you tend to a growing and evolving city and are rewarded by interesting buildings and monuments. And one of the buildings is known as the Face of the Ancient. And it's kind of your classic jungle trope, if you will, that you've probably seen online, on the internet, in art stations, or perhaps even in the classic 1990s Nickelodeon TV show called Legends of the Hidden Temple. Anyhow, I've also added a unique terrain idea to this build I've called Skull Vines, partly inspired by this photo of a Halloween gag. And what's novel about these vines is that they're functional, and they can be used to wrap up a player's mini or minis on the table that have been disastrously caught and are now entangled and slowly getting ripped apart by a cackling lichen-covered skull. Now, is this level of functionality necessary on the gaming table? Well, absolutely not. But it does bring a lot of spectacle to the encounter, and that's kind of the Barn Bard mantra. It's taking the craft to a whole nother level. There are a lot of weird little items and materials used in this build, so instead of boring you with a list of all the items that I use, I'll just post them in the doobly-doo down below. The Barn Bards are an Amazon affiliate, so if you do buy anything off of that list, a small percentage will go directly back into the channel. It doesn't cost anymore, it's just an easy way for you guys to help support the Barn Bard mission. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the build. I began this project by starting with the base of the ruin. I first cut out a 4" by 6" piece of pink foam that was 3/8 of an inch thick and started to draw my stonework with a bit of twisting vine motif to help sell the theme. I thought the altar should have a few layers of height to give it some vertical interest, so I cut out 2 more bases from Ready Board white foam and then started drawing random rock patterns around the edges. Third level was cut from XPS foam at 1/8 of an inch thick just to give a bit more variation, and when all were finished I placed them on a cardboard base. And you can see here that each level is a bit wider in dimension than the piece that sits on top of it. I'm just kind of eyeballing the dimensions here, really only concerned about making sure the base of my aquarium fit on the top level. I then cut out a small pedestal of XPS foam that was 1 inch high, 3/4 of an inch square at the base and 1/2 inch at the top, and then sanded it flat. My idea was to take one of these old Warhammer jungle tree canopy bits I had and turn it into a basin to hold the germ of the Golgari. I don't know if they still make these, but I had it in my bin box and thought they'd be cool to use. I then hand drilled a hole through the pedestal for my green LED light to pass through. Light was meant to shine through a green cat's eye marble, and I then bored a wide hole into that canopy basin in order to hold that marble so it wouldn't roll around, as you'll see here. It's a nice little place to sit. A little more line work was placed on the pedestal to keep selling that twine and vine theme, and then it's time to move on to wiring. I opted to use these cheap-ass 3-volt switches you see here, and needed to cut out a space for it to sit underneath the marble. I eyeballed these measurements as well, just a bunch of rectangles on top of each other. And once that was done, I added a bit more character to the base by cutting out random rocks around the edges of each level, giving it a more ruined look. The next step was to make sure my green LED light would fit nicely through the pedestal where it connects with the switch. And I should take the time here to mention that the lights I'm using are 12-volt Lighthouse brand LEDs that are really dope because they come with built-in resistors and shrink wrap connections. That makes the whole wiring process that much easier. You can get a bundle of these for 50 for 17 US. With everything measured and ready to glue, I took my trusty piece of concrete and began texturizing the edges of each base. And then using a medium-sized cheap brush, I applied a bunch of PVA glue to each level, squared them up by hand, and then carefully wiped away any excess with a wet sponge and let those dry for a couple of days. Following that, I started gluing the pedestal pieces to the base with Aleene's tacky glue, so the entire base itself could be painted together in all one fell swoop. Moving on, the next step was to work on the eyes of the aquarium piece I had, which of course had to be a glowing necrotic green like the marble on the pedestal, and my solution for this was to use these bitchin' little LED earrings I found online. They're super cheap, about $3 US a pair, and they give off a really powerful light, and of course can be used in a variety of applications where you don't want to mess with wiring. I then marked the position of the eyeballs with a Sharpie to get the statue's gazing proportions just right, and prime these holes with my archaeological excavating tool. I discovered that the hand drill I had wasn't powerful enough to go through the eye sockets, and so I used a legitimate electric drill to blast a couple holes at a diameter just big enough to allow the earrings to pass through. A quick test here to see if my earrings would fit through the holes and could be turned on easily, and sure enough, that was the case. Voila! We have glowing eyes of doom. The next step was to wire the inside of the aquarium piece to give it an ambient glow to the entire piece, which was achieved with this green LED light string I found on Amazon. I love these light strings because you don't have to fuss over soldering lights and such, and really all you need to do is glue the strip in place with a glue gun like you see here. Here I'm making sure that I have easy access to the switch and batteries, but it's a little bit tricky, I'll admit, as I tried to place the strip in such a way that all the lights were evenly spaced, and in doing so I ended up with a couple of small glue burns. But it was well worth it to see the relic emanate such a strong green necrotic glow, certainly worthy of Queen Vraska herself. Once the aquarium piece was finished, it was time to move on to the scatter terrain that was to serve as the cursed hill upon which the hidden relic stood. I went with XPS foam, cut into a variety of polygons that I thought would work well at the table in a modular fashion. My intent was to be able to use the scatter for other terrain settings, and so I cut a variety of angular shapes and sizes. These blocky pieces have kind of a fun old school video game feel to them. But in full disclosure, I wanted to mix them with a set of more organic shapes, which I have not done yet. Don't worry, they're on the list. The work is never done here at the barn. For this set, I used my Proxon to cut out the basic shapes I wanted and then scrolled around the edges with a hot wire to give it kind of a natural curve or sinuosity. And you can see here that what I was striving for in my measurements was a scatter piece that was big enough to allow the placement of skull vines or the skull vine bases all around the relic itself. As the bases of the vines are 2 inches in diameter, I just made sure that on all edges of the scatter terrain I could place a vine base without it falling off the edge. And then I marked the curved line with a Sharpie following that base all the way around. And the inside line is about 1 inch in from the outermost edge of the terrain piece and serves as the highest edge of the slope. So after these measurements were made, I then used another handy excavating tool to kind of serve as a pick and began gouging out the edges. You don't need an archaeology tool to do this, just use a screwdriver or a strong knife. But the idea is to create a sloping edge with kind of a rock-like or cliff-like variation to it. Don't forget to keep those scraps. You can use them for rocks and other scatter. It's a bit tedious, I won't lie, a bit of a workout on the old forearms and wrists, but the finished result I think looks pretty cool and certainly worth the effort. And once again, I share a moment with my trusted concrete friend and begin texturizing each scatter piece to give it a rough surface. Now you can use aluminum foil texture or to texture, and I did, but I really like the deeper gouges and depressions I make with this concrete, and it helps relieve stress. The next step was to create even more variation in the rough surface by using acetone to give it a more rugged look. A couple things about acetone is that it's fairly dangerous, and you should only use it in well-ventilated areas, preferably with an organic filtered mask. And 2, it's extremely destructive to XPS foam. You need to be very careful when you use this method because a couple of light strokes will melt a substantial amount of foam. You can see here that each terrain piece I'm just kind of melting where I think it looks cool, and then I have to go around and remove thin layers of fiberglass in each patch that was created this way. So I used both my archaeological picker and then a cheap toothbrush to kind of clean out the depressions. After I was satisfied with the sculpting step, I black bombed my pieces or based them with a 50-50 mix of black paint and matte finish Mod Podge, making sure I covered the entire piece to include the bottoms. Then after they dried, I moved on to dry brushing, and that was a pretty simple affair. 2-color process where I used dark coffee bean to obviously draw upon earthy tones, and then followed up with a dry brushing of soft brown sugar to complete the paint job. Next step was flocking the terrain pieces, and this was a 3-step process where I sought to get kind of a tricolor camouflage look. My strategy was to start with mid-tone green and put a layer of glue in the areas that I subjectively thought were the central parts of each scatter piece. Rationale being that mid-tone green would be more prominent and I could build around the edges of this color once it was set. So once the glue was placed, I took an old Parmesan cheese container and used it to sprinkle medium green flocking from Woodland Scenic in a liberal amount, and after a few minutes or so, took the piece and gave it a good knock or two to shake off the excess flocking material. It looks like there's a lot of glue, but don't worry, it dries quite nicely this way. And then after a day or so, I went over each piece and used my toothbrush to lightly remove any flocking that didn't take. I want to make sure it's nice and clean for the next round of flocking, which was the dark green color. Went with the premise that the darker colored flock, or i.e. grass, would be more centered and clustered around the depressions, where in real life there would probably be more water collecting and so on. So kind of the same process, but much more limited amount. The 3rd step of flocking entailed using a light mix of green and yellow on the peripheral parts of each piece, as this lighter color kind of looks more like your dried or weathered edges of a grass clump you would typically find in nature. So you'll notice I'm doing this all on flocking on butcher paper so I can recover most of the product when I'm done. So once again, in a few minutes, give your piece a bump. Make sure it's all on top of that flocking paper, and I found that it pays to eat a lot of pasta because those Parmesan containers are perfect for organizing the different flocking you might have and for applying it as well. I then moved on to painting the Relic base, and I won't spend too much time here discussing that because there's plenty of vids out there with great tutorials on how to paint, but what I will offer up for advice is the use of a color card. This is so you have consistency with your painting schemes. Now, typically for standard stone, I'll move through a black base, dark gray, light gray, and super light white dry brushing to get my desired look, but this card makes it easy to maintain color uniformity, and I highly recommend using one. The trickiest part of this build, as you might imagine, was the wiring of the pedestal, and I'm by no means an electrician, but I would recommend you go to Wylock's Armory, a YouTube channel that's greatly inspired me because of its clarity and usefulness of information, as well as great builds. But Wylock has an LED wiring video, number 56, that is well worth watching to learn the basics. Here you can see I have my LED wires in place, and I'm preparing to solder by first slipping some shrink tubing onto the wires to cover the join. I then start soldering the wires, making sure positive leads to positive and negative to negative. And if you've never soldered before, it can be a bit of a challenge at first, but stick with it and you'll achieve your goal. But after the wires were joined, I then used the shrink tubing to seal the joins for protection by applying heat with my lighter. And then, just to be a little bit extra safe, if you will, to go that extra mile for protection, I wrap that all with electrical tape. It's a bit ugly. I remind you guys I'm not an electrician, so please be kind in the comments. Once that's all taken care of, a quick test of the light to make sure it fits and turns on. Once everything's checked out, I could then commit to gluing it all into place. And for these more delicate parts of the build, I always opt to use my Aleene's tacky glue because I think it's stronger than regular PVA, and probably more importantly, it dries clear. But now that everything's in place, it's time to approach the foliage. The plant decorations I used for this build were bamboo and some random shrub package I found on eBay. And there are of course plenty of plant decorations out there to choose from, and at many different scales, so you just want to double check the size of what you're buying because you can easily end up with something that's disproportionate if you're not careful. Anyhow, to install the plant decorations, I merely pressed holes into the foam where I thought the plant should be, and then carefully glued them into place using some more of Aileen's fantastic adherent elixir. I just needed to make sure that the aquarium piece fit within the foliage, but other than that, there are no real hard measurements, just go with what looks good. And then finally, I added a bit of color variation to the vine motif I had pinned earlier. These are Vallejo brand washes in green and dark yellow, which of course sticks with the overgrown jungle vibe. The last part of this build has to do with skull vines, which are a homebrew monster that are basically like a creeper vine but with a fun little undead element added in the form of an evil revenant. To make these vines I used 22 gauge floral wire twisted into a 3-strand cable, much like you'd twist a rope or spin a yarn as it were. To get the vine started, I twisted 3 of these wires together by hand and secured it to my desk with a box clamp. Then once that end was secure, I used a pair of Leatherman pliers to grab the opposite end and simply twisted until the lay of the wires was tight and uniform along its length. And the result should be typical of a rope or stiff wire that you can twist around objects. For the next step, I used a type of modeler's decorative vine I found on eBay that shipped from Thailand, and is different from your standard flocking because it's very stringy, which is exactly what I wanted for these skull vines. So I shook off a bunch of the slough from these vines, collected it on my butcher paper, and then I created a little reservoir of PVA white glue in my artist palette so I could saturate the wires in preparation for flocking. I then drew the wires through the glue, helping to apply it with a cheap brush, making sure the wire was saturated, and then I just dabbed that entire wire into that stringy flock, making sure I had full coverage. I then set it on top of my plastic container you see here for drying, which is, it's nice because it not only holds the wire in good position for drying, but it allows you to recover whatever flocking didn't stick. So here I am cleaning off the loose flock with my toothbrush over my trusty black container so I don't make a mess. And then I set up to glue on a few flowers for added effect. Now, these flowers are typical of what you can find for decorating model railroad sets. I decided to go with yellow and white colors as I feel this is more sinister for some unknown biological reason. But the process here was simple in that all I really did was cut off some individual flowers and then glued them onto random areas of the vine using a gel-based super glue. I had to clean the flocking off spots where I wanted to glue the flowers, but applying them was pretty straightforward and they seemed to have a decent grip to the wire. To strengthen the bond, I did use a 50-50 mix of PVA glue and water and then sprayed that on with a spray bottle to give it a bit more adhesion for everything involved. For the skull vine bases, I used a combination of 3/4 inch washers and wood coins set on 2-inch washers, which were then glued together with a glue gun and covered with modeling clay. The reason I use washers for bases on nearly all of my projects is because that extra weight is really nice to have. Not only do they help support the piece in general, but when you drop them on the table during gameplay with that authoritative thud, it strikes fear into the hearts of your players. So once again, just a couple of smaller washers set on a wood coin on top of a larger 2-inch washer. And when these were glued and good to go, I pulled out some modeling clay to finish off the bases. I'm using a brand called Plus, which is an Activa natural drying clay, but I'm sure you can get away with pretty much any natural drying clay you're able to find in your local hobby store. The process here was to cut out a dozen 1-inch cubes, which I then carefully molded onto the bases by rolling the cubes into little cylinders, which were then placed on the washer. You can see that I carefully wrapped the clay around the center of the base and then just smoothed it out by hand, trying to form these nice shallow little mounds to work with. After these had a few days of drying, I black bombed the bases with a 50-50 mix of black paint and Mod Podge, the standard fare, and then drilled small holes with my hand drill into the center of each one. The holes I drilled were just a bit wider than the diameter of the vines themselves because I wanted to be able to pass the wire through but still have a snug fit. I inserted the vines through the holes with about 2 to 3 inches extra sticking out of the bottom, and then once the wires were where I wanted them, I simply glued them into place with my gel super glue. After a bit of snipping, I coiled the excess wire, which is approximately maybe 1.5 inches, into the base itself and sealed it with an extra plug of clay. You can see how the washer makes a nice little cavity for the wire to set into. And with the clay set inside, I think it ultimately gives it a little more support as well. When the clay plug had dried, I sanded the bottom smooth with rough sandpaper and a sanding block, and then moved on to the next step, which was to cover each base with a liberal coating of regular PVA white glue and then a flocking of pure sand to give it a nice rough texture. With the sand dry, I applied a heavy dry brush of dark brown to complete the earthly color, and then when this was dry, I drilled 1 or 2 holes per base to add some of the shrubbery decorations I'd used earlier in the build. Now note that I'm using the same type of plants that I had in the altar, and this was to give the piece an overall theme, if you will. I placed this type of plant decoration not only in the holes of the base of the skull vines, but also at the terminus of the vine itself to kind of frame the skulls I had. And the little skulls that I had purchased online, all that they needed was a little bit of a hole drilled into the back for the wire to sit into, and a quick dry brushing of olive green to give it a nice swampy look. As I mentioned earlier, my concept for this monster was that the skull vines are a necrotic manifestation of fallen warriors that have magically been brought to life by the hidden relic, the green glowing orb of the Golgari. So part of the aesthetic was to have skeletal elements and weaponry to sell the idea. So I just basically cut up a bunch of plastic skeletons into shapes that I thought looked cool, and some weapons as well, painted them so that they looked kind of old and tarnished. And then once I had a decent collection of skeletal parts and weapons, it was just a matter of carefully gluing them onto the vine bases, kind of making sure that there was an even distribution of embellishments. I then applied some larger pieces of gravel that I had on hand, rock by rock with tweezers for a little bit more variation. And in full disclosure, white glue works fine for this kind of thing. It's actually cheaper than the aliens I'm using here, but I kind of just wanted to use up the bottle. And then finally, to give it some flavor, I applied a liberal slathering of white glue to all the open spaces that remained, and performed one final flocking with some Italian seasonings. The Italian seasonings are great because they look realistic in terms of ground cover and they smell yummy, and of course they come in their own shaker. So final flock, once that was dried, I just spent a bit of time cleaning that off, and there you go, Bob's your undead uncle. So there you have it, my fellow crafters. You've discovered the legend of the hidden relic. Thanks for sticking around, dropping by the old Barn Bard channel today. Hopefully you learned something new you can use at your table. Until we see you next time around here, be safe, be well. We'll leave you with some video of what those vines look like and some images from the table. Until then, aloha.